Thank you and welcome to the show this morning. The topic this morning is the Institute of Applied Theology, and we're fortunate to have with us the director of the Institute, Swami Krishnapad. And Swami Krishnapad, let me welcome you to the show this morning.
We're very happy to be here.
And to say, first of all, I'm sure that I sort of garbled that title. It's the Institute for Applied Theology, is it not?
Applied spiritual
Applied spiritual theology, and of course we're simply delighted to have you here. But let's open this show before talking about the Institute itself and your position as the director of the Institute. Let's open the show by talking about you, and to have you to give our audience some information about your background, your education, and to explain exactly who you are, and in a real sense what you represent in terms of religion. Because I think when we introduce you as Swami Krishnapad, a lot of folks might not have a fairly good idea of what a Swami or who a Swami is, and the discipline and things that are necessary to elevate you to that particular level. So let's talk about that transformation that you made as an African American coming from Cleveland, Ohio, to be at this exalted position today as the Swami. Let's do it from that perspective.
Sure. Dr. Haney, I sort of wear three hats. From a Western perspective, I'm a scholar of international law and a psychotherapist. And I graduated from Princeton and a few other schools, Princeton University. From a African perspective, I'm an African high chief. Particularly, I was ordained about 6 years ago in Warri, Nigeria. And I oversee about 1.5 million people and what have you. Along with that, I have many, many monasteries all over the world. I have 20 monasteries just in Ghana and Nigeria alone. And so in those monasteries, we are connected with counseling services. We have farms, cottage industries. So the idea is sort of focusing on a life of spirituality and simplicity. As an African chief, I'm a consultant to many of the African leaders. I've been a consultant for maybe in the last 9 years or so to some heads of states in different countries. Several years back, I was working in connection with the United Nations International Labor Organization as a consultant in stress management, time management, and conflict resolution. Also here in America, various celebrities often call for my particular help. Now, from a Eastern perspective, I'm the only what's called Vaishnav guru, black Vaishnav guru in the world.
I would imagine.
So that allows me to involve myself in many world peace organizations. Particularly that's an Eastern perspective, so it's kind of dealing with the Vedic tradition, or what would be called sort of the Hindu family. So there's the Western, African, and Eastern side. Now, how I got involved in such? Well, all my life I've been a social reformer, a revolutionist. And at some point I began to realize that real change that was needed in the world could not be implemented just based on external transformations. There was a need for internal processing, internal growth. So my last year at Princeton, my dissertation was on Western psychology and Eastern philosophy. And my particular hands-on research dealt with what's called regression research, where psychiatrists and psychotherapists regress the patients sometimes to understand their problems. They're dealing with neurosis and psychosis problems. From that study, I became so convinced that there was so much more to the human condition than what Western scholarship offered. And I began to make that kind of investigation, looking more at the Afro-Asiatic cosmologies. And so that brought me into meditation and fasting and deep prayer and celibacy. I'm also a celibate monk. I've been celibate for about 28 years. And it's a way to selflessly try to, try to serve humanity. So since that time, I've been involved in many, many places in the world. It's about every week or so I'm traveling to a different country. I coordinate many interfaith gatherings because my training is in Christianity, is in Islam, it's in Buddhism, as well as Indian and the Vedic studies. And particularly I emphasize, as we look at the problems the world is facing now, of racism, tribalism, rise in crime and drug abuse, and even rise in religious fanaticism. These problems are fragmenting the world more than any other problems. So I try to play my little role in healing the planet, healing the community.
In other words, you take sort of a world view in terms of all of these issues, believing that many of these issues are interrelated. Would that be a correct assessment in terms of?
Exactly. See, the problems that we're now facing are really far beyond just addressing with material solutions. And they're problems that go beyond gender, they go beyond race, they go beyond tribe. They are inherent problems that need to be addressed. And as we look at the universals and at the inherent needs, we see that really there's one race, there's a human race, and there's really one religion. That's the religion of love and service to God. And there's one sense, there's one language, and that's the language of the heart.
And so all of those together, and so when you are called upon by world leaders like Nelson Mandela, and as I say, I raise these questions simply because I don't know the answer, and we would certainly like. What do you tell them? I mean, how do they go about bringing you into their service, and give us that kind of? And we're going to have a short commercial break in a minute, but we'll take that break and then we'll get back to it. But let's start us off by talking about, say, your relationship with the President of South Africa and how that relationship evolved and the impact that you think that you have had on that relationship and that relationship has had on you.
Sure. With many of the presidents that I have met and assist in various ways, we tune into nation building from more of a human and spiritual perspective. We examine things about how to deal with crime. We look at areas of resource depletion. And we look particularly at applying appropriate technologies that will help the present and guarantee a very viable future.
Applied spiritual technology, is that what we're saying here? Is that essentially that?
That's right.
And so they call you into their service, and those are the basic areas that you talk about.
And then according to the immediate problems. Just like, for instance, one of the earlier conversations I had with President Nelson Mandela in one of our first meetings. We've met many times since then. I was mentioning I had just come from a conference in West Africa, in Togo. It was a conference on corruption. At that particular conference, it was mentioned that African heads of states have remitted over $20 billion to their foreign bank accounts in the West. So I was tuning in the fact that so much of leadership in Africa and many places in the world has been leadership that's been exploitive and manipulative. And that it's very important that a person like him shows other leaders in Africa as well as in other parts of the world that a leader can remain principle-centered, a leader can have integrity and maintain high standards of ethics and morality. And that most important is that a leader should be a good example and role model for others.
And so, so we're saying that in a real sense, the suggestions that you're making are only one of the many trains of thought in terms of leadership and et cetera that these leaders are bombarded with. And unless they can hear the statements that you're making dealing with applied spiritual technology and that kind of thing, and how to apply it and how to bring those things about, then you are, in a real sense, absent from the table. Is that, I mean, that point of view is absent
it would
from
seem
the table.
so. See, I write many books, and some of my books are on leadership. My last two books, the leadership book, is being printed in 6 different languages. And it's like a manual of how one can imbibe higher ethics and spirituality, but in a sense that's not sectarian, but allows a person to have better character, to be able to exhilarate and inspire one's citizens or constituents, and to formulate policies that will be for the better good of the greatest number of people.
Very good. Let us take this first commercial break, and we'll be back talking to Swami Krishnapad from the Institute for Applied Spiritual Technology. And of course, Swami Krishnapad, before we had our first commercial break, we were talking about some of the things in your background and the advice that you've given to world leaders and et cetera. But let's talk about the Institute for Applied Spiritual Technology as an institute, because you are the director of that institute. Let's give you an opportunity during this segment to talk about that institute and some of the things that you think you are able to achieve and some of the things that you believe to be challenges that face you.
Mm-hmm. Some years back, I began to notice very distinctly that there were many people and organizations that were very astute, you know, materially. Mm-hmm. And there's another side of people who were very involved deeply in spirituality. Mm-hmm. But there was a problem in finding an organization that could do both. Mm-hmm. So I wanted to create an organization based in America, but that would have international influence, mm-hmm. where you would have spiritual people who are professional, material professionals, mm-hmm. and who are using their professions to raise consciousness mm-hmm. in a very kind of interdisciplinary way, mm-hmm. non-sectarian way. So we have an institution out of Washington, out of Capitol Hill, mm-hmm. where we have this amazing group of people. It's very cosmopolitan, of all different races, mm-hmm. all different religious backgrounds, different political persuasions, mm-hmm. etc. We have constant seminars and workshops. Mm-hmm. We are going to conferences constantly. We have health retreats. Mm-hmm. We have a lot of people, for instance, who are doctors, who are allopathic doctors as well as naturopath doctors. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And they particularly address things from a holistic perspective. Mm-hmm. Just as a few weeks ago, I was one of the guest speakers at the yearly conference for the National American Medical Associations. Mm-hmm. So these are doctors from all over the country. Mm-hmm. And my particular presentation was in the family practice section. Mm-hmm. So we had a chance to show how there's a need for serious healing, that the doctors are sometimes experiencing toxic consciousness, the patients, mm-hmm. the planet, and the community in general. Mm-hmm. And there's a need for addressing these issues in a more holistic way, mm-hmm. so that we look at the inner as well as the outer aspect. Mm-hmm. A few days ago I was in Atlanta, and I was one of the guest speakers at the yearly meeting or yearly conference mm-hmm. for the Religious News Writers Association. Mm-hmm. So in each of these conferences, people from the Institute would go along with me. Mm-hmm. We would present various things to assist in those areas, or we network in a way of professional people meeting professional people, mm-hmm. seeing how we can make a difference mm-hmm. at this very critical time in world history.
You know, at that Atlanta conference, I think you gave a paper there on African Americans and world religions. Let's talk about that. I mean, since, as you've indicated earlier, that you are the only African American guru in the world, and as I said earlier, people are still, I think, intrigued by the marvelous transformation in terms of where you started from and where you are now. But I mean, how did you become involved in a real sense from that perspective? Let's do it from that perspective.
So the distinction I hold is the only African or black, African or African American Vaishnava guru. Now, Vaishnavism is a certain aspect of the Hindu family. See, there are worshippers who worship many, many gods, polytheism in Hinduism. Mm-hmm. There are worshippers who worship the impersonal aspect of God. Mm-hmm. But the Vaishnava system recognizes that there's one God. Whether you call God Allah, Yahweh, Jehovah, or as we say Krishna, mm-hmm. it's the same God. Mm-hmm. And that God is particularly taking notice of the consciousness mm-hmm. and our hearts. Mm-hmm. He's not so concerned with whether we're praying in English and French and Swahili and Arabic and Sanskrit, etc., mm-hmm. but is concerned about the quality.
We pray.
About the quality. Mm-hmm. Now, in the Vaishnava line, we also understand that there are many bona fide prophets, and there are bona fide traditions, mm-hmm. and that the same God who sent Moses, who sent Jesus, who sent Buddha, mm-hmm. who sent Ramanujacharya, Madhvacharya, and Bhaskacharya, and many other great teachers, is the same God, mm-hmm. and that if we look close at their message, mm-hmm. the message is very homogeneous or very similar. Mm-hmm. The message can be looked at in three aspects. Mm. First, every bona fide religion says one should love God with all one's heart. Mm-hmm. We call this surrender or sarangati. Second is that one should love one's neighbor as oneself. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. We call this dasu dasono, dasu being the servant of others. Mm-hmm. And three is that this world is not our home. Mm-hmm. So these are three distinct essential factors of all bona fide teachings, mm-hmm. and the prophets come to facilitate that. Mm-hmm. But unfortunately, the majority of people on the planet practice their religion as if God is only for them, and as if there's no other bona fide practitioners or literatures, etc. And this is another form of tribalism, racism, etc.
And so your main aim is to bring about a greater diversity among the way folks, while you recognize that there are these different worship and methods, that you're trying to bring about a greater uniformity among all of these various groups under these three major ideas.
And that is what is most natural. Life is very variegated. And when there is unity with diversity, we have the most powerful synchronistic scheme. But when there is diversity and there's not unity, then there's fragmentation. So if we really love God, then we can go deep and deep into our own bona fide tradition, be chaste to that, but because we are lovers and experiencing deep consciousness, we'll appreciate others who are also experiencing deep consciousness. See, every religion and tradition has its hypocrites, and every tradition has those who are being more genuine into that tradition. So as we go deep into the tradition, there's great wealth. Now, I involve myself more in the Vedic tradition, because the Vedic tradition is literally has the oldest scriptures practically known to humankind, and also some of the most encyclopedic. And it's very eclectic, very universal, and very much attuned to the beauties of other traditions.
It does not separate itself from.
Exactly, exactly. And my own background and upbringing is that I kept seeing how sectarianism is fragmenting the world. I did not want to play into that. I realized that how can I worship a God who's sectarian? That God is not like that. So therefore, people who practice like that cannot be so much genuine lovers of God. So I went back to these ancient traditions to be able to understand my Christian backgrounds better. So I'm really still a Christian in the real sense. See, there's a difference between churchianity and Christianity.
And perhaps in terms of that worldview, and especially since you mentioned all of those ideas that many people associate with Christ, you know, love God with all your heart, and that more than anything, it probably brings about a greater unity among what you're saying. And let us take this second commercial break, and we'll be back with our audience. During this final segment of the show, Swami Krishnapad has agreed to talk about two of his most recent books. One, Leadership for a Higher Consciousness, and the other, Spiritual Warriors, Part 2. And of course, what we'd like to do during this final segment, Krishnapad, is to have you to talk about these two books that you believe are very, very important in terms of trying not only to deliver your message, but perhaps creating a situation to bring people together. Let's talk about it from that perspective.
As these two recent books are being translated into 6 different languages and being used at several universities and in management courses. And one may ask, why would a spiritual person be interested in writing a book on management, a book on leadership? Well, I think we can see from some of the recent things that's happening here in America and other parts of the world that one of the biggest problems we're dealing with also is a crisis in leadership. That there's a lack of leaders with integrity, principle centeredness. There's a lack of leaders with a servant leadership consciousness. So we wanted to take so many powerful ideas and techniques from sacred scriptures and to present those techniques in a way of how to solve material problems that we are now being confronted with. So it's like a handbook. And I've personally given this book, this is the second edition, now we have it in pen and paper cover. I've personally given this to about a dozen presidents, you know, within the last year and a half or so, myself. And it's been sent out, you know, many places around the world. It's been appraised by members of the United Nations, high-level gentlemen in the business community, as well as in the educational community. My other book, which came out a few months ago, which is called Spiritual Warrior 2, Transforming Lust into Love. And this is in a series. This is the second one of this particular series of the 6 books that I have. I was asked, believe it or not, Dr. Haney, to offer a message to the nation on Valentine's Day by members of the Washington Post staff, the editorial staff. And it was just around the time that this book had come out. So the message dealt a lot with how a leader's private life and public life should be similar. Because the private life, especially when we look at ancient conceptions and from a point of religiosity and leadership, that one's private life is as or even more important because it tells you what the person is really about. The public life is often a performance. And what is manifested in the private life is gradually going to come out through policies and other things in the public life.
That's as within, so without.
Exactly.
That's the enlightened Western point of view. Very
Yes,
good, okay.
It's right on your head. So this book has been highly appraised because it's helped people in resolving conflicts in their marriage, because it also looks at sexuality from a physiological, metaphysical, sociological, psychological, and most important, spiritual perspective. It distinctly deals with how to really convert the lust into love. You know, we're having most of the marriages now ending in divorce. We're finding that children are becoming much more violent. And so we're addressing things that allow people to understand what are some of the problems that are underlying these particular concerns.
And now these books are, how are these books available?
They can be ordered from any bookstore. Swami Krishnapad, if they look it up in the bookshops, Spiritual Warrior, 1 and 2, and Leadership, as well as they can find out about some of the other books that we're having available.
Now, and speaking of books, you are, I think, on a book tour now, and you will leave here, head into some other city to talk about. What do you do when you make these tours at these various book fairs?
At least a half a dozen things. First, of course, I'm going to a lot of the bookstores and doing lectures and book signing. I do some programs, you know, at the university, some lectures, some workshops, seminars. Have a chance to do like we're doing now, address the media, television, radio, newspaper. And then I visit some of my own communities that I directly oversee. See, for instance, I have a community in Pennsylvania of about 500 acres of land where we're teaching people how to build their own houses, grow their own food, make their own clothes. All the clothes I wear is made by some of my students in America and Africa and India. And to grow and to produce our own medicine and to gradually learn how to use alternative energy. This is significant because as people can control the variables in their life better, they can be more natural, which allows them to be more spiritual. And it's a way of showing that religion should not just be only Friday to Friday, Saturday to Saturday, Sunday to Sunday, but it should be something that's a part of our existence every day, that improves on our life and on the quality of life for others.
And of course, during this last 45 or 50 seconds that we have here, Swami Krishnapad, let me thank you for coming by and giving us that excellent information today. And as we said before, many of our audience perhaps will be as myself, which is to say that I really didn't know that much about your religion and your point of view and etc. But we're certainly encouraged by what we hear, and there are so many things that happen in the Western tradition, as you undoubtedly know, that are part of what you're doing in another tradition. And certainly we just want to thank everybody. Not only do we thank you for coming by, but we thank the people that made it possible through the many months that we've had an opportunity to work with your people for you to be here today. And again, let me encourage our audience to tune in again next week for another informative edition of Comments. Thank you.